Alright, this video today is going to discuss almost everything you need to know about grammar. So first of all, sentences are made up of clauses. A clause contains a subject and a verb, or in functional terms, a participant and a process. A clause may also contain certain types of circumstances, which are adverbial or prepositional phrases telling things about location, manner, circumstances in general. So some basic clauses are I swim. It's got a participant and a process. The dog barks. We went to the store. I enjoy classical music in the evening. These all have one original thought. But there are two types of clauses. There are independent and dependent clauses. An independent clause contains a subject and a verb and expresses a complete thought. So an independent clause is a sentence, such as Jim studied in the library for his chemistry test. But there are also dependent clauses. These contain a subject and a verb, but they don't express a complete thought. A dependent clause cannot be a complete sentence. A dependent clause is also marked off by some sort of conjunction or a dependent marker word attached to it, such as when, although, but, if so, because, after. When one of those words is attached to a clause, it makes it dependent. For instance, when Jim studied for the test, it was noisy. When Jim studied for the test is a dependent clause. It's dependent on the rest of the sentence for meaning. So independent clauses can be turned into dependent clauses by adding a conjunction, like I said. And these dependent clauses are also often movable. So if you start a sentence with a dependent clause, such as when Jim studied in the library for his chemistry test, it was noisy, that same dependent clause could be moved to the back of the sentence, in which case you wouldn't need a comma. For instance, it was noisy when Jim studied for his chemistry test. So these dependent clauses are often movable. They're either put at the beginning of a sentence as an introductory phrase, in that case they're followed by a comma, or they are placed at the end of a sentence, in which case they don't need a comma. So I want to get into various types of sentence patterns. So the most basic type of sentence is a simple sentence. It contains one independent clause. For instance, doctors are concerned with the growing rates of asthma. Or my favorite movie is probably Southland Tales. It has a subject and a verb and contains a whole thought. The second type of sentence pattern is a compound sentence. And in this case, a compound sentence with a coordinating conjunction. So a compound sentence containing two independent clauses together can be connected with a coordinating conjunction. You can think of a simple way to think of coordinating conjunctions is with the term fanboys, which stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. These are your coordinating conjunction words. So when you have an independent clause, you can put two independent clauses together by putting a coordinating conjunction between them with a comma. For instance, doctors are concerned with the rising rates of asthma, comma, but they are unsure of the cause. Or my favorite movie is probably Southland Tales, comma, and my second favorite film is most likely Jupiter Ascending. So you can see that there are two independent clauses in both of these sentences connected with a coordinating conjunction with a comma before that coordinating conjunction. Another type of compound sentence is connecting two independent clauses with a semicolon. So using the same examples, unlike a coordinating conjunction, you don't need an actual conjunction word. You can just use a semicolon to connect two independent clauses together. For instance, doctors are concerned with the rising rates of asthma, semicolon, they are unsure of the cause. Or my favorite movie is probably Southland Tales, semicolon, my second favorite movie is most likely Jupiter Ascending. A fourth sentence type is a compound sentence with a conjunctive adverb. A lot of students get this one wrong, so let me explain this one. So you can have two independent clauses connected with a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb. These are words like, conjunctive adverbs are words like although, however, consequently, words like that. So here's the formula. Independent clause, semicolon, conjunctive adverb with a comma, and then an independent clause. For instance, doctors are concerned with the rising rates of asthma, semicolon. However, comma, they are unsure of the cause. Or my favorite movie is probably Southland Tales, semicolon. However, my second favorite movie is most likely Jupiter Ascending. A lot of students will put a comma instead of a semicolon here, but yeah, you can connect two independent clauses with a semicolon and followed by a conjunctive adverb and a comma, and then the rest of the independent clause. Fifth type of sentence pattern is a complex sentence. Complex sentences are made up of at least one dependent and independent clause. This type we're going to look at begins with a dependent clause. And the formula for this is you have your dependent clause marked off with a conjunction like when, although, if. Then you have a comma after that introductory dependent clause, and then you have the independent clause. So for instance, because, this is the marker word, doctors are concerned about the rising rates of asthma, comma, they have called for more research into the cause. Or secondly, although Southland Tales is my favorite movie, comma, Jupiter Ascending is a close second. So this is the kind of sentence structure where you have an introductory phrase with a comma, and then you have the independent clause. You can also do it the other way, so a complex sentence beginning with an independent clause and then followed by at least one dependent clause. So the formula for this is independent clause plus the dependent marker word and then the dependent clause. So for instance, doctors are concerned about the rising rates of asthma because, that's the dependent marker word, and then the dependent clause. It is a common treatable disease. Or my favorite movie is probably Southland Tales because it is a sci-fi masterpiece often overlooked by critics. Another type of important sentence pattern is one with non-essential phrases. An independent clause with a non-essential phrase. This is often used in signal phrases to introduce an author. So the formula for this is the first part of the independent clause, the non-essential phrase marked off with commas, and then the rest of the independent clause. The phrase is called non-essential because it is not essential to the whole meaning of the sentence. You could take that phrase out and the sentence would still make sense. For instance, many doctors, comma, including pediatricians and family practice physicians, comma, are concerned about the rising rates of asthma. This is non-essential information. You could take out this phrase and the sentence would still make sense. Many doctors are concerned about the rising rates of asthma. So when you want to put in non-essential information, set it off with commas in the middle of the sentence. Or for instance, Southland Tales, comma, directed by Richard Kelly is my favorite movie. Like I said, when introducing authors, you can often use this type of sentence pattern to introduce your authors in a non-essential phrase. Some phrases are essential. You can have an independent clause with an essential phrase. So some phrases are essential for a sentence's meaning. The essential phrase cannot be removed from a sentence because it is essential to the meaning. The sentence wouldn't really make sense without that phrase. So, for instance, and there are slight and subtle differences between essential and non-essential phrases, but for instance, many doctors who are concerned with the rising rates of asthma have called for more research into the causes. So I'm arguing here that this is an essential phrase, who are concerned with the rising rates of asthma, because it's identifying a certain type of doctor. So that phrase would be essential to the meaning. Or for instance, I have two brothers. My brother who lives in Iowa has 3 children. For this example, if you had 2 brothers, maybe one lived in another location. So you would include this, the one who lives in Iowa, to identify which of the brothers. So kind of a little quick wrap up on how to use commas. You put a comma before an introductory clause or phrase. Put a comma before coordinating conjunction. Use commas to set off non-essential phrases. And also use the Oxford comma, putting a comma before the last item in a list. So I'm going to talk about a couple errors that can frequently happen when you're writing. One of them is called a comma splice. This is the use of a comma between 2 independent clauses. A comma is not a strong enough punctuation mark to connect two independent clauses. For instance, I like this class, comma, it is kind of fun. That right there is a comma splice because a comma cannot connect two independent clauses. So how would you fix this? You could insert a period between the two independent clauses. You could insert a semicolon. You could make one phrase dependent on the other. For instance, I like this class because it is kind of fun. Or you could put a coordinating conjunction. So I like this class, comma, and it is kind of fun. Another often sentence error that occurs quite often is a run-on sentence. This is when two independent clauses are not separated by any appropriate punctuation. For instance, my professor is very intelligent. I have learned a lot from her. Here are two independent clauses jammed together, so they're a run-on sentence. You need to have some kind of separation, punctuation between two independent clauses. So how to fix it? Just like how you fix comma splices, you could put a period between the two independent clauses, you could put a semicolon, you could put a coordinating conjunction, or you could make one a dependent clause. Finally, another type of sentence error is a sentence fragment. This is when a sentence does not contain a subject and a verb or express a complete thought. So you can have very long phrases, but those phrases might not include a main subject and verb, making them a sentence fragment, because a sentence needs to have a subject and a verb. So for instance, walking down the street last Tuesday while listening to music, that is just a dependent clause. There's no actual subject or verb in that sentence. Or since I like fishing, that is just a dependent clause as well. Or the reason why I will never be late to the airport ever again. This is one long subject here. The reason why I will never be late to the airport is one long subject. It'll need a verb, and it'll need to express a complete thought. So be on the lookout for those as well. So now I just want to move into some of the basic features of academic writing. It has been argued that academic writing features three characteristics. One of being explicit, one of also being distanced, and then finally, academic writing is complex and highly structured. So first of all, being explicit just means, and lexical here, precise lexical reference or more elaborate lexis, just means words. So explicit means having explicit references, using proper terminology, using elaborate word structure, being as clear and explicit as possible. Secondly, academic writing a lot of times has a certain distance to it. You're oftentimes writing in a third person. The setting is often distanced. Your audience is really does not really provide much interactive help or clarification with the message you're sending. When you're pointing to certain types of contrasts or contexts, there is no assumption of any kind of shared background knowledge with the audience. So you basically have to put in and embed all that context within the writing itself. So if you're saying, if you're using referentless pronouns like this is why or that is the reason, the reader would not know what you were referring to by saying this or that. You're going to have to be explicit and spell things out for the reader. And then finally, academic writing is complex and highly structured. It has a complex syntactic structure. That just means it has a complex grammatical form to it. It's cohesive and it's coherent. Cohesive meaning it's connected and ties together and flows, and then coherent meaning that it's appropriate to the purpose and circumstances for which you're writing. It uses elaborate exploitation of proper word choice and grammatical resources to express complex messages and structures, and to integrate and explain relations between pieces of information. Language stratification. This is looks like a very confusing chart, but language is stratified, meaning language operates on multiple levels. At the most basic level, we have things like phonology and graphology. Phonology is speech, and graphology is writing. So, obviously, texts are made up of writing or speech if they're spoken. Lexicogrammar is the next level. This just means wordings as well as grammar. So um, words, speech, makeup, um, grammar, sentence level writing, words and word choices. At the next level, we have what's called discourse semantics. This is things at the paragraph level. How do things operate at the paragraph level? This is also where things like in rhetoric, ethos, pathos, and logos operate. Rhetorical meaning. That's a little bit beyond just grammatical meanings. Okay. After this discourse level, we have register, which is a way of analyzing context, the context of a situation. And there are three different register variables that make up a context: the field, tenor, and mode, which I'll get into in a moment. But field is just the activity that the language is partaking in. Tenor is the social relationships around that activity. And mode is the channel and form of communication that a message is taking. Register operates at the level of a stage of a text. So there might be multiple stages in a text. Genre, the context of culture, which is made up of patterns of register patterns, is the text as a whole. And there are different types of genres, but we can think of that as the text as a whole. Finally, we get into even higher levels of um, ideology. This is meaning across a number of texts. And finally, ideologies are influenced by certain codes that are generated by distributions in the social structure. So this is a way, language stratification is a way of looking at language from its most minute meanings of speech and writing, which make up grammar, which makes up paragraphs, which makes up parts of a text, which make up a text as a whole, which make up and then consist of patterns of discourses across patterns. And then we can also think of the social structure as generating specific codes that influence ideologies that then are encoded in text, that are encoded in the context of the situation, encoded at the paragraph level, encoded at the grammatical level, and even encoded at the word and writing level. So here's a way of looking at language stratification that's a little bit simpler. So at the most minute level, we've got phonology and graphology, or speech and writing. The next level, we have lexicogrammar, which is words and grammar. This is the sentence level of a text. Sentences are made up of participants, nouns, noun phrases, processes, verbs, and circumstances, prepositional and adverbial phrases. Sentences make up discourse semantics at the paragraph level, which also is where rhetoric operates, of ethos, pathos, logos. And I'll get into eventually different types of meta functions. But text can also make ideational and representational meanings. They can make interpersonal meanings, and then they're always encoded in an actual text. Register, the context of situation. So these are different stages of a text with the field, tenor, and mode variables, which I'll get into. Genre, the context of a culture, is a text as a whole, and like I said, ideology spans a multiple range of texts. Let me look at the register of context of situation for a second. So this is a way of actually analyzing context and linguistic choices in context. So field is concerned with how language portrays certain activities and presents ideas. And field is made up of nouns, and a text field is made up of the nouns and noun phrases, the participants, the verbs, the types of processes or verbs, and then the prepositional and adverbial phrases or the circumstances, as well as construing logical relations through like coordination and dependency. Tenor is just taking a stance. This is about interpersonal relations between the writer and the reader, or the speaker and the listener. And tenor is oftentimes encoded in the mood. So is it a statement you're making, or are you making a question, or are you making a demand? As well as modality. This is sort of like the qualifiers, talking about conditionality. Words like may, perhaps, present a certain interpersonal level. And then there's things like appraisal, evaluating things, and attitudinal resources of emotion, which we'll get into some other time. And then mode. How is the text actually structured? What kind of cohesive devices tie the text together? Also looking at things like the theme of the text. And the theme is just the first slot of a text, and then the new is the rest of the text. We can get into that some other time as well. But let's look at sentence analysis a little bit, looking at field. So sentences consist of participants, nouns, noun phrases, processes, which are verbs, and circumstances, which are prepositional and adverbial phrases. So in the sentence, the dog caught the ball in the backyard, we can see that the dog, the noun here, the subject, is a participant. The dog is participating in this experience, in this action. Caught is the process. The ball is another participant. And in the backyard is a circumstance telling where this happened. You can also look at more academic writing. Academic writing still uses participants, processes, and circumstances, but they might not be living participants. For instance, the sentence, much of Baudrillard's work was a commentary on late capitalism. Much of Baudrillard's work is the major participant here. This is the thing kind of doing the action, if there was an action here. Was is the process of relation, relating much of Baudrillard's work to this other participant, a commentary on late capitalism. My only point to get across here is, although academic writing can be very complex, it still is just made up of participants, processes, and circumstances. Here are the different types of processes or verbs. There are material processes of doing, such as sedimentary rocks form in water. Behavioral processes look at conscious behaviors, like I was just stretching. Mental processes relate to kind of inner processes of consciousness, like I think the teacher knows about it. Things happening in your head. Verbal processes of saying or writing, such as she says, she told you about it. And then finally, relational processes describe or identify things, such as she is president of the club, relating she to the president of the club. So those are different types of processes. The very last thing I wanted to get into today was the process of nominalization or grammatical metaphor. Nominalization is this process of turning verbs and verb phrases into nouns, and it's often used in academic writing to densely pack a large amount of information into a text. So you can think of this one way as turning processes, new processes, into known participants. For instance, Johnny failed the test. Nominalized becomes something like Johnny's failure to pass the test. Or the process of inventing the telephone was invented, becomes, in a nominal phrase, the invention of the telephone. So it's important to know how to use nominalization appropriately so you can pack already known information into sentences so you can make your writing more complex. But at the same time, nominalization can also be overused, and it can also be used to sort of obscure who is doing an action, and it can also become a little bit too jargony at times. So be careful how you use nominalization, but it can be used for good effect. So I just wanted to show you an instance of academic writing that is highly, highly nominalized. So for instance, and I also just wanted to point out too, that when you're sort of analyzing sentences, an entire noun, lots of information can be packed into one noun phrase. So for instance, I wanted to point this out. Here's a piece of academic writing. Based on a longitudinal analysis of changes in student writing samples and district and state test scores over an academic year. That is all one circumstance. This is all one functions as one circumstance, okay? That's how packed things can get. So I want you to be able to start kind of figuring out, identifying whole noun groups, okay? The findings, which is the participant here, indicate, which is the process, and then look at this long participant that we have. That instruction in SFL metalanguage helps students recognize and name linguistic patterns within and across disciplinary texts and expand their semiotic resources. That is all one participant, this whole noun phrase. And here's another circumstance, especially as these resources relate to realizing meaning in print. So I want you to start identifying large nominal groups and seeing how they function, and just to start understanding that a noun isn't just one word. It can be nominalized into a whole group of words, and this is sort of a way to start comparing and making very dense writing and making complex and logical relationships between different ideas in text.